We're live. And I was like, oh, like it's just going to automatically start. Okay.
Discussing right now is there's never a dull moment in
Can
the
you hear
federal
pretty
government,
good?
but
Yeah.
sometimes we
No,
need to
turn up a
talk
little bit.
about things that maybe aren't on people's radar screens right now, just because they're important subjects.
That's good.
Highlighting something that's relatively unknown but faces an impact by the federal government, it's important to share. And it's no secret that I have not been the biggest fan of the so-called war on drugs in this country. We need to go after those who illegally sell substances that can kill. But scheduling marijuana as a Schedule One substance like heroin is, well, stupid, given how many states have legal laws around selling marijuana. Psilocybin is something that now we have universities and nonprofits and companies researching as it's found ways to help people significantly in what used to be something that people just considered to be mushrooms. And something that also doesn't get a lot of attention, but is at risk, is a product called kratom. Kratom is a plant from the coffee family, largely grown in Southeast Asia, and it's been used by millions of people as a personal medicine or a product to help people who find it useful for a number of different purposes. It has certain psychoactive compounds that interact with the body's opioid receptors, primarily, and I'm going to try to pronounce these. Mac, you're going to be so much better at this than I'm going to be, but mitragine, I'm probably killed that one, and 7-hydroxy mitragine. I'm not even going to try. I'm going to let you do it in a little bit. In low doses, these offer mild stimulation and can act as an energy booster, much like the coffee bean does. In higher doses, it can act as a sedative, and people use it to help with some ailments, pain management, and to help, in particular, we're seeing with opioid addiction. But the federal government for years has been kind of all over the place on the regulation of kratom. The FDA in particular has had a target on kratom, listing it as unapproved and dangerous. But when asked why, their answers have been anything but honestly helpful or consistent. And kratom is currently banned in 6 states, but legal in some form in 44 states. And with the rise of, I think, things like synthetic heroin and an overall lack of regulation, kratom users find a product that they use as adults to help them is at risk. Fortunately, there's a group called the American Kratom Association that is working for common sense laws and regulation of kratom. And with us today is their public policy senior fellow, Mac Haddo. Mac has had extensive background working in government and politics. He served as the chief of staff at the Department of Health and Human Services during the Reagan administration, a former campaign manager for Orrin Hatch in the Senate, and as a former state legislator in the 25th District of Utah. Welcome, Matt Haddo. I'm sorry. Welcome, Mac, and thanks for being with us.
Well, Congressman Pocan, thank you for this opportunity. You've been a true champion for consumers of kratom in the United States, and you are revered in that community, and we appreciate all of your support for our efforts.
Well, I'm glad you're here because I think this is something that, again, sometimes they're just subjects that the best part of my job is I'm learning every day. 13 years in, and I'm still learning every day in this job. And, I can help to try to put a little light on things like this because we know how important these issues are for folks. So, you've got an extensive background in Republican politics. I just explained, all of that. But kratom safety and regulation really has no political agenda, right? This is something that is about as nonpartisan as you can get.
It truly is not partisan in any way. And in fact, when the FDA made its first attempt to schedule kratom as a Schedule One substance back in 2016, as you'll recall, you led, along with Congressman Matt Salmon from Arizona, a conservative Republican, and there were 26 Republicans and 25 Democrats who signed the letter to the DEA urging them not to schedule kratom. And on the Senate side, you had very diverse interests like Orrin Hatch, at the time, one of the most conservative Republican senators, and Bernie Sanders. And if you get those two together, there's nothing partisan about what they're advocating for.
Right. So I probably should have started with what is kratom, how you would describe it, and what has brought you to this fight for consumers who use kratom.
So kratom is a plant that is grown in Southeast Asia. And in terms of the pronunciation, I can tell you that whatever you call it, you're going to be pretty close.
Okay.
The compounds in kratom And over in Southeast Asia, for example, they call it kratom. Some call it cat. There's all kinds of names associated that are colloquial to the regions in which it is grown. Here in the United States, it's kratom or kratom. There are two compounds in the kratom product that are of interest. One is metrogyne or mitragynine or any other, again, characterization of it, lots of different pronunciations, and 7-hydroxymetrogyne. The 7-hydroxymetrogyne is a compound that does not occur in the natural plant, but rather occurs only when the leaves are harvested in Southeast Asia, laid on the ground or in drying beds to dry, and it's the heat or the oxidization process of drying those leaves that creates 7-OH. And it is a very powerful compound that only occurs in trace amounts in the material that's shipped to the United States. They have to dry those leaves so that you can't ship leaves to the United States because of the moisture content of the leaves, and you get mold and fungus and makes it unusable here. So drying it and powderizing it then creates a different product than what they use in Southeast Asia and have used safely for centuries, because there's this added component of 7-OH in it. And what we found that up until 2023, that trace amount of 7-OH has not been a problem or a safety factor at all. But in the latter part of 2023, some very creative people in the marketplace decided that they were going to concentrate artificially 7-OH, and they now have flipped the product compound into a 7-OH product, the majority of it being 7-OH, making it a very powerful, dangerous opioid. And the way they do that, they obviously already have dried material. They take and add, in order to oxidize the plain kratom metrogyne into 7-OH, they take the chemicals you use in your backyard pool and they oxidize this material that way. So it creates a very dangerous product. And as you said earlier, none of us want to see a prohibitionist state. None of us want to be in a position of advocating for prohibiting a consumer from using a product that is otherwise safe. But there are instances, and this is one of them, where you have an industry that just went off the rails. And that's why recently you had the HHS and the FDA commissioner have a joint press conference, which in my 45 years in public office working in dietary supplements, having been heavily involved with Senator Hatch and his efforts on the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, passed in 1994, by the way, unanimously by the Congress. You don't see that happen very often anymore. And that was a grand compromise to restrict the FDA from being onerous to consumers. And here you fast forward to today, and I think that they may have gotten it right, but you don't see a commissioner and a secretary announcing something other than it's a very urgent, imminent threat. So we're looking closely at this. We want to get it right, and I think all of us do. But kratom, thankfully, and this is great news, I think, largely because of your efforts, FDA is starting to look at it more closely, and they see the safety profile. They actually did what's called a human dose finding study, the FDA, and what they did is they take a cohort of kratom users and a cohort of placebo patients, and they administer some amount. In this case, they started with 1 gram. They went up to 12 grams before they stopped the study in an effort to try to get a serious adverse event. And then they would know exactly what the levels of safety are. The FDA predicted they would get to 6 to 7 grams in a 5-minute period. That's a lot. And then they would start to see adverse events, seizures, those kinds of things, serious adverse events. It didn't happen. They got to 12 grams of kratom, and the only thing in a 5-minute period, and the only thing they observed was people were a little nauseous, but the placebo group was in the same condition, meaning that you consume that much plant material in a 5-minute period, you're going to feel sick, right? And so they called the study off, and they say today, the FDA says, kratom appears to be well tolerated at all dose levels. I can tell you they would not have done that study. They would not have examined and self inspection of what their own position was without your great leadership. And we're enormously grateful for it. And now I think the FDA is on the path to find the right safety protocol. With a little nudge by some legislation, I think we'll get them to actually regulate kratom appropriately for the benefit of the 24 million Americans who currently use it.
Yeah, that's a great update. And, I'll tell you what brought us to it, or me and the people I think that I've been working with, is, we had a personal friend in another state and who had an ailment that she was at the point that she couldn't go back to work. It was interfering with her life at that level, and found that kratom was like literally the only thing. In fact, the doctors had caused it by overprescribing things to her to begin with. And then it was this that allowed her to go back to work, and she's working and productive and everything out of it. And, given that, just in my general, concern about the drug war we have in general and how we execute it, really brought my interest out there. But now I've talked to so many people from your association and others who've come by and talk about how they've used it to help their lives. Can you talk a little bit about that? The people who are using kratom, what are they using it for, and why is it important to them?
That's an excellent question, because there's a study that was done by the University of Florida about consumer uses of kratom products in the United States. And they found that roughly the population of kratom consumers breaks into three groups. One is a group that would replace a cup of coffee with kratom because it gives you a little energy boost and increased focus. At a little higher serving size, they found another third use it to reduce feelings of anxiety and depression. And it has real mood lifting ability. And that's a great thing for people used responsibly. And then the third level are those people that find that they can manage acute and chronic pain with kratom without the side effects of opioids and falling into an opioid addiction. And a subset of that group are people that are using kratom to wean off of the opioids or illicit drugs that they're on. And a great Johns Hopkins study of 2,700 opioid users who were addicted, they used kratom to wean off of that addiction, and 87% reported that it reduced their cravings, their withdrawal symptoms, and that 35% replaced the opioid or illicit drug within a year. Those are great positive results, and it shows. And if I could anecdotally tell you an interesting experience, I got into an Uber in Las Vegas after finishing a conference, and I jumped into the Uber, and of course, your first name pops up to identify you. And the driver said, Mac. He said, "Are you Mac Haddo from the AKA?" And I was a little startled. I said, "Well, yes." He said, "I watch all of your podcasts and your videos." He said, "You have saved my life." He was a two-time Afghanistan veteran who had been banged up with service-related injuries. And he said he was in the VA program, and they had him, his words, zonked out on opioids. He said his life was over. And then someone in the program said, "You should try kratom." And he did. And he said it became the thing that saved his life. And he described how he had a family again, how he was productive with the job, and it saved him. And that's the kind of thing that I hear over, and you've heard over and over again, that kratom can be that lifeline. Obviously, people have to manage their kratom use appropriately. They should get advice from a doctor and educate the doctor, because many times the doctors have no idea what kratom is either. But that's important. And you hear these examples. And one other, if I could, I was sitting in a hearing in Ohio, and the Ohio Board of Pharmacy had recommended scheduling kratom back in 2020. And they had to do a public hearing. They had 320 Ohio residents that showed up, lined up to speak. They had allocated far few hours to do that. They got halfway through it, and a young man stood up. Now, he would not be my ideal candidate if I'm an advocate, right? And this guy stands up. He has a leather vest on with no sleeves. He has tattoos all up and down his arms. His tattoos came up his neck. He had piercings. He had a bald head except for a mohawk. And I'm thinking, wow, that's not the best advocate to be talking to these guys. And he sat there, and he was shaking. He was so nervous in this microphone. He said, "A year ago, I was in federal prison." He said, "I was a drug dealer and also an addict." He said, "I was an addict when I was in prison." So obviously he was getting contraband drugs. He said, "I got into the halfway house." And he said, "But for a friend of mine that I made at the halfway house who introduced me to kratom," he said, "I'd be back in jail or dead." He said, "I can tell you that kratom saved my life." And he said, "And I know," and he had the same sense I had, I think. He said, "I know, looking at me, you're probably thinking, well, so what?" He said, "But I want to introduce you to someone who benefited from my success story." And he turned and introduced his wife with a newborn baby.
I love that.
And I'm telling you, it melted people. And shame on me for judging him as being an advocate. Here's a guy whose life was turned around and saved by it. And I hear that so often. So I'm not as judgmental today as I used to be, because I learned that lesson. But what a powerful message. And shortly after he testified, the executive director of the Board of Pharmacy in Ohio picked up his napkin and waved it to me and said, "Out in the hallway." And he said, "We're done. We're going to drop this recommendation. We're convinced." He said, "If you could tell the people, and there were still 60 people lined up to speak, that we're done and we're not going to pursue it. I went out and talked to them, and they said, well, some of them have driven hours. And he said, okay, we'll listen. So about 30 people did continue to testify. But what a great example of how you change public policy with the expressions and testimonials of people who actually have had their lives altered in a positive way from this kind of substance.
Yeah, well, out in Washington, I met, not from my district, but a woman from Wisconsin, a grandmother, who literally looked like the woman who used to give me candy after church when I was a kid, who was telling me that she was using Kratom and would continue to break the law in Wisconsin because she had to, or one of the 6 states that's not legal, because it was helping her with pain management. And her daughters were there with her, her adult daughters. And again, the stories, I've heard so many, and people getting especially off of opioid addiction. It's just really strong. So why do you think there is this concern that we've seen from some of the federal agencies? And, I noticed it seemed to be a little bit of a spike when there was a synthetic heroin that was created and it was being sold at gas stations, etc. And one of the components within it was Kratom. And then that's when I started to see some of the increased activity at the FDA. But what is the reason that you think that we've had to fight in the way we've had to fight on this?
So this is an excellent point, because a scientist was describing in a hearing that I was sitting in one of the states, and 18 states have now passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act that gives a regulatory structure. And she said, she's from Johns Hopkins University, and she said the problem with Kratom is it's boring. Because people take it doesn't give you a high. Right. It doesn't get you any kind of euphoria. It doesn't draw you back to be addicted. She goes, people just use it because it gets a benefit of how you feel, your mood, and it helps you with some minor pains and aches. She said, if you're a drug seeker and you're looking for that high, Kratom's not your bag, right? And that illuminates what happened in the early 1960s or 70s or 90s. I'm sorry, 1990s. Kratom really got into the space of the smoke shops. And the smoke shop guys started tinkering with it because Kratom is boring. And so they wanted to spike it up a little bit to increase sales. And that's what happened, unfortunately. So you saw what you saw was an adulterated product that had Kratom in it, but it spiked with bad stuff. And that's what needed to be eradicated. And the FDA was right to interdict that. And the DA was right, but not Kratom itself. Go after the bad actors that mix these things together.
So on the positive side for the federal government, because I do think there are some agencies that do kind of get it. And, I know the National Institute on Drug Abuse, for example, NIDA, has been researching Kratom, and they've been studying the potential therapeutic applications and its impact on the brain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, glad to. Dr. Nora Volkow, who's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, known as NIDA, she is a great advocate for Kratom. She actually has a lab. She has Kratom in her own lab that she works on there at NIDA. And her description of her support for Kratom is based on the fact that it offers the potential for being a very valuable harm reduction tool for people that are struggling with opioids. And she actually provided a fascinating answer to me on some of the criticism that I hear from some state legislators that say, well, why are you allowing Kratom to be sold in a gas station, for example? And why is it so easily available to people? And why is it not a prescription? And she said that the problem for people that are suffering from addictions, opioid addictions, that are looking for some pathway out, they can't find a bed in many cases because they live in rural areas where beds aren't available.
Right.
And she said, even for those people that live in an urban area, they can't afford them because they're just too expensive. Insurance doesn't cover it. There's a stigma associated with seeking treatment. And she said, if we can take a substance like Kratom that that certainly isn't dangerous like an opioid isn't going to kill you, and you just have to manage it in terms of your consumption, she goes, that's a great thing. And that a light bulb went off in my head when you hear this criticism. Well, yeah, why should it be this accessible? And it is because people that are out there using it in that category that find it to be beneficial as a harm reduction tool ought to have access to it. And Dr. Jack Henningfield made an interesting analogy when he was talking to legislators about why it's so easily accessible and why it shouldn't be, why it's illegal according to the FDA at the time. And he said, well, if you had someone that was drowning in a lake would you not throw them a life preserver, even if it wasn't Coast Guard approved? Of course you would. And that's the issue here. Now, thankfully, the FDA is changing their attitude. Not there completely yet, but they're changing because they're seeing the safety profile based on good science showing that kratom is safe to consume with appropriate labeling and with good directions on what the serving sizes are. And that's where we want to get to, is have it accessible to people for whatever you use it for, making sure that it's safely formulated and properly labeled.
So talk about that regulation that you're seeking, that you've seen now. It was it 18 states you said passed something. Talk about what you think would be the best way to be able to regulate.
So 18 states have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. They're not all the same because legislators like to get in and tinker around. Some of the regulatory agencies are different in different states, but essentially the framework is the same. That in order to sell a kratom product in the state, you would have to register your product with an appropriate state agency. You would have to produce a certificate of analysis on the product formulation from an independent laboratory certifying it's compliant with the regulations. And what those regulations essentially are, that it follows good manufacturing practices, so you don't have salmonella, E. coli, microbial contaminants, that the formulation of the product is based on pure kratom leaves or extracts that use FDA-approved food-grade solvents. You don't want a product that is heavily extracted using very powerful chemicals, because then it becomes highly concentrated and dangerous. And then you can't have more than 2% of the overall fraction of the compound in the product of 7-OH. You can't let that get out of control. And we're now adding a provision that you can't have more than 1 milligram of 7-OH in a serving. That eliminates the problem with synthesized and highly manipulated chemically 7-OH products. And then we require labeling that instructs people that they should seek advice from a medical professional. Pregnant women should not use kratom. Not that we think it's dangerous, we don't know. And so when you're in a vulnerable state like that, in a high risk medical situation like a pregnancy, you shouldn't take it. We have heard reports of babies being born with kratom dependency. And so that's of concern. So those warnings should be on the label. And also warnings that about the number of serving sizes and the number of servings to take in a day. We think those are appropriate. And then it should be age restricted. We don't want kids to have access to a product that requires them to use responsible behaviors in order to do it. And kids aren't known for that. And so I think that 18 or 21, whatever the jurisdiction establishes, we support, because we think that these ought to be products that are available to adults that can make good decisions.
And we're also trying to do this at the federal level, right? The Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act. It's a bicameral, bipartisan bill. Can you talk a little more about those efforts that we're doing?
Absolutely. And thank you for your efforts. On the House side, your sponsorship of the previous bill, we're redoing the bill and hopefully going to get resubmitted shortly, adapting for the decisions made by the FDA and HHS. And Congressman Jack Bergman on the Republican side has been your co-leader in the House, but there's strong support, again, bipartisan support. On the Senate side, you have Senator Mike Lee of Utah, arguably very conservative guy, and you have Cory Booker from New Jersey. And you know, when you see that kind of unification of effort to protect consumers with safe products, we think it's important. One of the interesting things that we're trying to navigate in the newly revised version of this bill is how we stay away from altering the DSHEA Act, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. We want to make sure that there's a pathway for kratom products to be fairly evaluated by the FDA to protect consumers, but we don't want to implicate other dietary supplements. They should have to go through the appropriate pathway in order to get approved, because there is a controversy, but the FDA believes that some of these other dietary supplements really don't have a good safety profile. They don't have the effects that they claim. So we support that kratom has to be properly labeled. It has to be properly formulated, food grade solvents for extracts, and no synthetically derived compounds in the kratom product to make it safe. And so that's our thrust, and we're looking forward when we can refile that bill with your leadership and we can move it through the Congress.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, having an association like yours to do the heavy lifting work you're doing, you know, we're trying to do what we can within the building, but you know, when you have so many people, consumers who are using this product, and it's legal in 44 states already. Like, we need to do something to make sure that we address some of the concerns. So let me raise a couple of the concerns if I can, and just if you could respond to that. I know that there have been some situations where press accounts aren't experts on kratom because they don't have the information, like most people who are probably listening to this podcast haven't heard it. The fact that sometimes someone may have had an overdose and within their body are multiple substances, one of which might be kratom, and therefore I think there have been that part of the story making it sound like kratom could be a problem. Can you address some of those stories?
What is he doing?
Yes, and
I don't
it's
know
true
what's
that there
happening.
are some parents or family members who believe that they've had a fatality in their family that resulted from kratom. The analysis that's been done by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, by HHS, and by the FDA, they all agree that kratom deaths are rare. And when they do occur, it's because of polydrug use or adulterated kratom products. It's back to what was the catalyst for the FDA to get really amped up about kratom occurred in 2019 when there were 9 deaths in Sweden in a 12-month period attributable to a kratom product called
She was like in his
Krypton,
bed.
which was widely available in Europe and the United States. And 9 deaths in a 12-month period is a big number in a short period of time, and it's a legitimate concern. And so the FDA started to push back on kratom. They imposed an import alert. They don't have the authority to ban it alone, so they started developing that. What the FDA has never told people, even in the recent Federal Register notices when they tried to ban kratom, they list those 9 deaths, but they don't tell people. And by the way, they're actually statutorily obligated to do so. They just ignored it. There was a peer-reviewed published study that was conducted by Swedish scientists on those 9 deaths. And what they found was someone had added an adulterant, O-desmethyltramadol, which is the chemical used in the production of the opioid tramadol. That's what killed these people. So what we're finding is that when you have reports of deaths associated with kratom, it's polydrug use or adulteration. And so the polydrug use part is a little more nuanced. If you are on an opioid and someone tells you, well, you should try kratom, and you use kratom to wean off of that opioid, in that journey, you may overdose of the opioid. And when the medical examiner or coroner looks at that death, they see kratom in your blood system and the tox report, and they say, oh, that's a kratom death. It's actually someone that was being helped by kratom, or at least they were attempting to, but it was the illicit drug or the opioid that killed them. This is part of what NIDA is analyzing. They spent more than $100 million on research. And they're finding that this is the problem is adulterated products or polydrug use, not kratom itself. And now the FDA's dose finding study affirms that kratom is well tolerated at all dose levels. So it is a terrible thing to hear about these deaths. It's hard to not be sympathetic because you've lost a loved one. But, my view is that those families deserve to know the truth. And if a medical examiner coroner gets it wrong, just because it's convenient to call it kratom as the cause of the death, they ought to be accountable for that. And I'll give you an example. I had a mother call me in the state of Ohio 2.5 years ago, and she said, my son died, and the the coroner's investigator came to his apartment, and he saw a bag of kratom product on his nightstand, and he immediately said, this is a kratom death. And she said, I told him, no, my son was an addict, and 5 years ago he found kratom, and it saved his life. For the past week, he's been complaining about chest pains related to COVID and possibly an injury at work. And then he was supposed to see the doctor, but he died. She goes, he didn't die from kratom. And so the investigator said, hearing the mother, said, okay, let's give it 8 to 12 weeks to get a tox screen. Then we'll know for certain what it is. The next morning at 10 a.m., she gets a call from the head coroner, and he said, I have sufficient evidence to determine this is a kratom death. And that's what they listed on the death certificate. And her call to me was, can you help me? And I said, what do you want? She goes, I want the truth about what caused the death of my son.
Yeah.
So we with her sued the coroners. And in the course of discovery, that you have to go through in any lawsuit, and lawsuits are horrible. But you get into these discovery things. We ask for the actual tox screen report, and that was conducted by a leading lab in the United States that's highly credible. It's NMS Labs out of Philadelphia, one of the leading forensic toxicology labs in the country. And they got the subpoena for the records, and they immediately called our attorneys and said, we want no parts of this case. First off, you should know that the level of metrogenine in the blood screen was 256 nanograms per milliliter. That's not enough to kill anybody. That was their conclusion. She goes, we would not have called this a kratom death. And so our attorney said, well, what other substances did he have in his system? Because the mother didn't think he was on anything. And they said, well, we weren't asked to examine for any other drugs. We only were asked to talk about metrogenine. Wow. So that, of course, tells the tale. We don't know at this point because they settled the case. They changed the cause of death to undetermined because they made a mistake. They leaked to the wrong conclusion. Now, it's likely that he had a medical condition, and his mother believes it was because of kratom. I'm sorry, because of this underlying health condition with the heart problems he was having. But it illustrates the problem. And the Centers for Disease Control did an analysis of medical examiner coroner reports, and they had 152 deaths where the coroners and medical examiners reported kratom was present, and 92 of them they said was they detected kratom enough to put it on the death certificate. When the CDC examined all of those, they found they were all polydrug use. It wasn't kratom. And there were 7 that didn't have enough information, so they went and got the tox screens and the blood samples and tested them. 4 of those 7 had sufficient blood samples to test. All 4 of them came back as polydrug use with a more sophisticated testing methodology. So the problem is that people, including coroners and medical examiners, have leapt to this conclusion because the FDA was so hard on kratom to say it was a kratom death. And now we're finding, and even the FDA admits it now, rare, and when it does occur, polydrug use and adulterated products. Kratom is not killing people. Now, is it possible that you could overdose on kratom? The pharmacology doesn't show that it does. It doesn't suppress your respiratory system. But anything's possible at a high enough level. So we always hold out the possibility that if someone abuses it, you might end up with an overdose. But using it responsibly, according to labeling instructions, kratom does not kill you. No matter what the plaintiff's attorneys try to tell you, or even these families that suffer tragic losses, we think they ought to know the truth. And the truth is far more illuminative of what they should know and what the public should know about kratom use, and look at the real cause of those deaths.
And you're fighting right now this 7-OH that's getting the attention right now from the Trump administration and others. You're actually fighting to make sure that we have this in safe levels and we're not allowing this adulterated product, correct?
Absolutely. We think that the 7-OH should be limited to what naturally occurs, and that the highly chemically synthesized 7-OH is obviously a designer opioid. It's a street drug. And so we think that should be banned. The interesting thing about the 7-OH is that when it was introduced in the market, they claimed, and I met with the 7-OH manufacturers because they were calling them kratom products, and they're not kratom. And we made an agreement. We won't call them kratom anymore, but they assured me that they met the federal standard that's in federal law that says that when you introduce a product in the market, you have to have a reasonable basis for safety under conditions of use, meaning the labeling. So they said, oh, we have that. We have all the science. That was in October of 2024. I then invited their chief scientist to come to a symposium where we were discussing the safety of kratom. And he stood up and said, well, actually, we don't have any studies to show the safety of 7-OH. We're working on it. We hope to have it by mid-2025 this year. This was in January of this year when he told us this. And he said, maybe 2026. Well, those 7-OH products, if they have a pathway to market, have to have the science behind it. You have to have the evidence and data. And so they should wait, but they jumped the gun because of money. They made a lot of money in this space. So our view is prove it. Go through the process at the FDA to prove that you have a new drug application, because the 7-OH, the only benefit it provides you is it gives you euphoric high, and they say it has amazing pain relief. Well, if that's the purpose of your product, then get a new drug application and stop selling it to people the way that you're doing it now. That's our argument. I'm not opposed to 7-OH if it's properly regulated and it's marketed responsibly, but currently it's not. And that's why we think it should be scheduled, forcing them to go back through the new drug application process.
So we talked a lot through this, and you're such a great expert, Mac, and your association does a lot of great work in Washington and in the States, and appreciate all those efforts. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think it's important to share to our listeners who either may be hearing about Kratom for the first time, or some of the 24 million people that are currently using it that would be beneficial?
Thank you for this opportunity, because I think the most important message I could give to a consumer is that because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe. And Kratom, I hear a lot of Kratom advocates say, oh, it's just a plant, it's safe, it's like it comes from the coffee family. All of that's true, but that does not necessarily mean that it's safe. This is a product that does have psychoactive properties. It has to be formulated properly and as safely, and you have to use it responsibly. And so consumers have to understand that. There are probably 8,000 Kratom vendors in the United States. And when I tell people that, they go, wow.
Yeah.
The vast majority of them are what they call small batch manufacturers, meaning that they buy their Kratom raw material from a farmer that they've developed an association with over in Southeast Asia, and they ship it to them directly. And those small batch manufacturers regularly call me and say, you're putting regulations that will force us out of business. And the regulation that they don't like is, we require you to test the product to make sure that it's free from microbial contaminants. We require you to test your finished product to make sure that it has the level of metrogeny that you say it does, and it doesn't exceed the safe levels. And I say, yes, I'm trying to put you out of business if you're unwilling to meet those requirements that are consumer protections. That's not an overburdened bureaucracy that's trying to put you out of business. These are minimum safety requirements. And I know I get a lot of criticism by these people because there's a lot of them, and they regularly criticize me on social media. But the truth is that we advocate for responsible regulation in order to protect consumers. And I'm hoping that Wisconsin shortly becomes one of those states. And the good news is that the Controlled Substances Board in Wisconsin has formally acknowledged that Kratom doesn't meet the criteria for scheduling in Wisconsin. They've simply gone back to the state legislature that imposed the ban originally at the behest of the FDA back in 2015. And they just did it because the FDA said, we're going to schedule it federally, which hasn't happened. So I was on a trip to a National Conference of State Legislators meeting, and it was in Iceland. And the airport in Iceland from Reykjavik is about an hour and 10-minute drive. And so we were on a bus, and a woman sat next to me, and she was the president of the Wisconsin Senate. And we introduced ourselves, and I said, I'm with the American Kratom Association. And she slapped the seat and she said, we've got to fix the problem in Wisconsin on Kratom. We need to make it legal. And
talk about perfect timing.
And I said, this is fabulous. And so Speaker Voss was also on the trip.
Especially Wisconsin.
So I got the two of them together. There was a misunderstanding between the two bodies about what the objectives were. The common denominator was both of them acknowledged that you have been the great advocate federally, and that we need to fix this in Wisconsin. So we're working hard in this next legislative session to make that happen, and the responsible regulation in Wisconsin.
Well, Mac, how do people follow you or the American Kratom Association on socials?
So AmericanKratom.org is our website. You can go on there and you can find all the social platforms. Here's one piece of really bad news that maybe I can get your help on. Meta or Facebook has banned all Kratom discussions. They take advertising for Kratom firms and 7-OH firms, but they will not let any of our advocates mention the word Kratom. So they took our American Kratom Association Facebook page down. So we're now scrambling to find other options. We need to fix that because someone at Meta needs to explain that.
A bipartisan letter we could do.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe even call their lobbyist in and say, what are you doing?
Yeah. No, thanks for telling me that, Mac. Appreciate it. And thanks so much for being on today. I learned a lot, and I've been working on this issue for a long time, but your passion, your knowledge certainly have come through on this program, and appreciate your time.
Well, you're very kind, and we, again, deeply appreciate your leadership on this issue.
Great. Well, thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, they need to get on Facebook.
Clocked it. Yeah. Well, I mean, come on. We know why.
Well, yeah.
I mean, yes, initially this time last year, Facebook did censor anything in all Kratom because whenever you would type it in the search bar, it would bring up the whole drug awareness. What the fuck? You need help for drug. Yeah, that shit. And then, so earlier this year, I forgot exactly when I had noticed that you're able to talk about Kratom again on there. You know, you could search and actually spell the word out, you know, and then our opposition group figured that out or found out by stalking us, you know, and you don't see none of the opposition groups posts or the Kratom haters posts being reported.
Yeah.
They're going after all of the positive stuff. They're trying to silence us, truth tellers.
So that they can have all of their stuff online, you
Yep.
know, so that their story, their side of the story can be told and not ours.
Yeah.
And again, like I say all the time, if you got to do stuff like that, if you got to like cheat and
Mhm.
silence the other side, then
You're hiding something.
Mm-hmm.
You're hiding something.
Yep.
You know, and just like, you know, Mac was talking about that Ohio mom, which I remember when I first freaking watched that. You know, I was watching
Yes.
it live when it was happening. And I teared up. I was like, wow. I'm like,
Yeah.
these medical examiners are literally causing generational trauma,
Yeah.
you know? And that's what we see with our opposition group, you know? I initially felt sympathy and empathy for them, but after witnessing the stuff that they do behind the
Yeah.
scenes, nah, you ain't getting my sympathy card.
Yeah.
I'm keeping
you
that
could-
for somebody who needs it.
It's like you can only feel sorry for a bully for so long.
Yeah.
And then you just got to say, hey, you know,
And they want to prop themselves up as being a nonprofit group now, or a bunch of different offshoots of nonprofits. Like, come
Yeah.
on now. Shit.
insane.
And I say this all the time too. I don't care. I mean, you don't have to like me. You can guarantee you I don't like you, but I ain't going after you.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Everybody has the right to their own to use their own voice for whatever.
Mhm.
Everybody should have that right. Nobody should be silenced because somebody doesn't agree with them.
It ain't our fault that the science is silencing you.
Yeah, exactly.
The hell?
What the hell?
I know. Like, we ain't in middle school no more.
Yeah.
Karens, grow the fuck up.
Well, this
But
is
yeah.
fun. I gotta go pick up my kiddo from school. It's Friday.
Yes. Friday.
Friday.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, everybody.